with the neuroscientists really showing that your brain is different on art. Your brain is different after experiencing beauty. Your brain is different from playing music. That was always sort of an observation that they couldn't back up with, a picture being worth 1,000 words. So it's, all of these pieces are moving in the right direction, and it's an exciting time.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Magic Pencil, Voices of Writing Through. Our 10th anniversary season is very exciting, and I'm very excited as well because I get to talk to someone I've known actually for decades, which is kind of astonishing to think about. She's an incredibly talented, bright, creative woman. Her name is Lisa Wong. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Hi, Sue. It's great to talk with you.
Great to talk to you too. Before we get into some of the big questions that we're trying to answer over these podcasts, maybe you could just tell everybody a little bit about you and your background and what you do.
Sure. I'm a pediatrician by profession, and I am also a musician. And I was a musician first. I started piano when I was 3, and violin when I was 8, and viola when I was 40. And now I devote most of my time to the intersection between the arts and health. And so I teach a course at Harvard on the role of music in education and health. I've been in the Longwood Symphony for over 40 years, and that's where you and I met, and that's an orchestra of medical professionals. I advocate for arts education for every level from pre-K all the way to senior citizens.
That's terrific. Even though I'm not a physician, we did play in this orchestra together. I play the violin ever since I was 7 years old. But I always wondered, what is this connection between medicine and music? And that's really how we reconnected. I started to think about this book I was writing, and I reached out to you because there are these doctors' orchestras everywhere. And I really had trouble figuring out, why is that connection so strong? What do you think about that?
Yes, that's been one of the central questions of my life too. And it's been very exciting as we've been able to get better and better tools to help us understand this. We've been able to actually see where in the brain musical training changes the brain. And a lot of those parallel with the needs that we have as caregivers. For example, playing music improves your communication skills. The link between your receptive language and your expressive language, that link is called arcuate fasciculus. But that is basically a pathway, a highway between those two centers of the brain. And because when we're playing, we're talking and hearing all the time as musicians, that gets strengthened. And so when they look on a functional MRI, they can see musicians with thicker arcuate fasciculuses than non-musicians. And equally, across between the left side and the right side of the brain, because we use both hands all the time when we're playing, and also we're thinking and creating art and thinking back and forth between the left side, which is sort of given the credit for being the thinking side of the brain, and the right side, which is the beauty side of the brain. Because we're doing both of those at the same time, there is thickening between those two sides too. So once you put down highways, just like in, outside infrastructure on the roads, once the highways are down, you can drive anywhere you want. And so musicians have just more capacity for ideas to go back and forth because of the musical training that they had since they were little.
That's really fascinating. And I know when I started to think about this, because I was putting together a writing through program for medical school in Phnom Penh, some of the research that I did showed that for people who do creative writing, this whole idea of telling stories and understanding people's stories is a direct correlation with what you need to do as a doctor. You need to be able to listen and understand people's stories so that you can diagnose what's going on with them.
Yes. And so your question originally was, why are there so many medical orchestras? And that's been fascinating to me because there aren't a lot of lawyers' orchestras or computer science orchestras. There are few, but not as many. But I think you've hit it on the head, the empathy part of it that we have learned as orchestra members and also embrace and love, because we want to hear what the trumpet solo is going to be and the flute solo, and we cheer them on as we're playing in our viola section. That's very similar to what we do in the hospitals, on the wards, or even in our clinic. We cheer on our other medical professionals, but we also empathize with our patients and families. To me, it's just sort of the same kind of listening for the melody. when you're talking to patients. And if you need a team as an ensemble to help solve the problem, then great, you know how to do that.
I love that, listening for the melody. That's great. And you wrote a book about this, didn't you? Can you talk a little bit about your book?
I did. I actually was the president of the Longwood Symphony for 20 years. And as I transitioned away, because I really wanted to do a deeper dive into arts and healing, and so I passed the baton on to an executive director. At that point, I thought I would write down my ideas and my experiences before they faded away. And so I wrote a book called Scales to Scalpels, Doctors Who Practice the Healing Art of Music and Medicine, which was asking the question of why, when we learn music, do we end up being doctors? And basically, it was stories of my musical colleagues in the orchestra asking them questions of when did you start your instrument? When did you decide that you would not be a professional musician, but a professional physician? And what made you stay with your music? And why is it so critically important to you? And started wondering about the neuroscience and wondering about our desire to always give back, the whole service aspect of doctors and service aspect of musicians. So that all came together. And now, 10 years after the book has been written, a lot of the questions are starting to be answered. And a lot of people are really thinking about how important the arts are for well-being and for healing.
Right. And I remember you telling me that a lot of the skills that you learn as a kid when you're learning to play an instrument, things like perseverance and attention to detail, things like that, are necessary for furthering study in science and medicine.
Absolutely. I mean, not only is it training your fine motor skills, so our friends in the orchestra who are surgeons will say, this is because I practiced scales all my childhood. I can use my fingers in a way and tell my fingers what to do in a way that I don't think I could have done before. And even a colleague who had given up the oboe for 10 years when he went to medical school, he's a radiation oncologist. And when he started playing again, he said, the sensitivity to my fingers has come back and I can palpate tumors better. I have so much more control over my fingers. So absolutely those skills, but perseverance, resilience, and also the interesting one is being comfortable with ambiguity. So every time you play a piece of music, it never is the same twice. And that's okay. And if you're playing in a chamber music group, if the second violinist goes faster than you thought they were going to go, you can either say, no, the tempo is exactly this, and I'm going to just keep on playing my tune, or you go with it because then the whole group sounds better. And so you make those micro decisions every single minute or every single second as you're playing. Or if somebody's playing a little sharp, do you stick with your pitch or do you sort of compromise?
Yeah,
And so
what
all
do
of
you
those
do?
well, it depends on how far off they are, I suppose. But mainly it's the good of the group and it's the beauty of the music that you're in service to. So whether you're going to stick with your pitch and find disharmony, it's the same as when you're working in any other field, I think. That's what I love about music education for kids is they can be practicing this kind of work in a safe space. And it doesn't mean because you don't agree on a tempo, it doesn't mean that, your knives are out or, nasty words are spoken. You work
Right.
it out or you try both options. So they're learning safe and constructive ways of compromising. And I think that's something that we've lost a lot, especially post pandemic. Kids didn't learn that because on Zoom or virtually, they just don't talk. There isn't the back and forth that something like playing in a musical group can give you.
Right. That social connectivity.
It was really interesting. I was just observing, there's a school that I'm on the board for called the Conservatory Lab Charter School. And it's 450 kids from around Boston. It's by lottery, and about 90% are Black and brown kids. And they get musical instruments and music lessons every single day from kindergarten on. So I was observing a fifth grade string class the other day, and they're playing a G major scale. And after they played the scale from memory, then the teacher said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you guys doing with your memorization and how are you doing with that scale? And the kids were saying, oh, well, maybe a 4.5. And then another was like, yeah, I think I'm a 6, but I just need a lot of work on it. And they were saying all of these scores and she was just sort of writing them on the board with no judgment. And she said, okay, well, I think we average out to about a 5. So how are we going to get up to a 10? And it was the entire group of kids in the room who, as a group, were trying to figure out how they could improve their scale in a safe space.
Yeah, that's great. I had never heard that before, but it is so analogous to what we do at Writing Through, especially in our first session where we write a poem together. And this idea of listening safely without judgment to what other people say and building on it, and then rethinking your ideas based on what other people have said is so important.
Especially when they're just learning, and especially when they're so vulnerable to social media that is usually a black and white immediate judgment. For them to have a space where they can stretch things out and experiment is important. Well, and then there's your another analogy. They can experiment with their playing. They can also experiment in the lab.
Right. And I love the word practice. To me, practice has two main connotations. You practice your instrument, and doctors have a practice. And
Absolutely.
when you connect it in the way that we've been talking about with music, it starts to have a different sort of a meaning. It's interesting.
Yeah, the other thing I think is the curiosity, and that comes with practicing because when you're trained as a musician as a kid to practice, it is, play this and think of every possibility of how it goes and come to a conclusion of what works or what makes the most sense to you and back it up with why you play it that way. Those are all great training for non-verbally expressing yourself, for later on saying, okay, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. And not just because that's how it always has been, but because I've thought it through.
Exactly. And this leads me to the big question of this year. And actually, it turns out one of the big questions of my life is the meaning of creativity and how you live a creative life and what that means to you. But the first thing that comes to mind is when you were talking about playing in a safe space without judgment. We talk a lot about having that little critic on your shoulder, especially as you're an adult, who's always saying, oh, no, you did that wrong. And oh, no, don't do that. And I like to think that the word no is the death knell of creativity. You've got to say yes. And I think that music has done that for me to the point where when I moved from a big city to a little island where there isn't an orchestra and I couldn't really find an outlet for playing my violin, I said, well, I could play the drums. So now I'm playing the drums like a 14-year-old boy. But the idea of saying yes before you know how you're going to execute it is a big part of creativity. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that because you've gone from one thing to another, and there must have been a lot of times when you chose to say yes, even before you knew what you were going to do. And even if you had that little critic saying, how are you going to do this?
Well, one of the things that I think about creativity is it's basically eggs in a basket. And we're all given a basket and we've got a bunch of eggs. And sometimes the eggs in your basket are musical eggs, and sometimes they're writing eggs, and sometimes they're a little bit of both. Because I find that after I played a big concert and when I was running the orchestra, my creativity was not just playing in the orchestra, it was creating the concert and making the posters and selling the tickets and thinking about the service aspect and all of that. And so all of those pieces, it was part of the symphony that I was creating. I think I just happened to also play in the orchestra. But then the day after the concert, you get this letdown that everybody always does after a performance, especially big ones. It's just like, and then what do I do? Because the wheels are still spinning, but the concert's over. And that is the point at which I usually find myself sewing, writing, drawing, or cooking, or doing something else. And so it's the same creativity eggs, but they're just transformed into something else for a while. And then that dries out and I go back to whatever, or the next concert starts coming up and I start practicing or something like that. It's also a dangerous period for me because it's when I look at a calendar and it looks a little blank, so I fill all of it in. And then when I get to those dates, I wonder what I was thinking. But I think creativity is basically curiosity, and living a curious life and a creative life go hand in hand, especially with making crafts and playing music and all of the arts. It's an exploration that is both use of your hands, which as a musician you start doing so young. And as I said, when I started the piano, I was 3. So I mainly know how to express myself through my hands, and then just trying to decide what form it's going to be taking. So as I speak to you today, I am sitting in my dining room that is covered up to the top of the tables with fabric and yarn and a sewing machine because we were between concerts. And so I ended up making a whole bunch of stuff, but now it's sitting here sitting still because I've gone back to music. So those transitions are the hard ones of like, what am I going to do with all this stuff?
Right. But it's interesting. So in other words, creativity creates energy.
Back and forth. I think
Yeah.
untapped energy has to be fed into something. Otherwise, it becomes a frustration or you can't sleep or something like that. And I would prefer to put it into my hand. Similarly, I don't play the piano if I'm working on something intensely on the viola. But sometimes all of a sudden it's just like, actually, I need to find the piano.
Why don't you? How are those incompatible?
Time, just time.
Time. Well, yeah. That's always the bugaboo, isn't it?
Yeah. But
Right.
making crafts is a very good procrastination for not having to write papers that are due.
And I wonder, do people ever say to you, "Oh, I'm not creative"? And if they do, how would you respond to that?
Yes, they do. But then I think a few questions in of asking, well, what do you do with your time? They say, well, I just cook or I work in my garden. I think not giving themselves permission to define creativity in a broader sense. Because I think as beings, we are always seeking beauty and creating beauty. And that's another parallel I found in medicine. Our main job as physicians is to help our patients find their beauty. It's whatever level that they can. It may be that they have then a new reality. If they have a disability or if they had a severe illness that's become a chronic illness, then how do you move with that? Not move it beyond it, but move forward with that and incorporate that, but also continue to seek beauty, and that's the way to wellness. Which is why it's just not just another prescription. The arts are really critical to that. So right now, this is moving up very quickly in the national conversation about how important the arts are in every aspect of people's lives for the purpose of achieving wellness, and with the recognition that Western medicine is not the only piece of wellness that we seek. In October, President Biden issued an executive order asking all of the departments to reflect on how the arts can be incorporated into their work. So, Health and Human Services and the arts, the CDC and the arts, the Surgeon General's office and the arts,
Wow.
on and on from there. And it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in the States, as I did in public school, in the arts were always the first thing to get cut. And to
It's
think that that's
short-sighted
not
though.
the case anymore.
Unfortunately, it still is, but at least now there is a movement toward coming back to how important the arts are. Because when you think about it, when you look back at history, what's going to survive? Mainly, it will be the arts that will survive through the generations, and that's what we see in the museums, and that's what we read. And
Yeah.
some of those things are 400 years old, and they're still masterpieces.
It's fascinating, and it actually is very encouraging because part of what we're trying to do at Writing Through in this 10th anniversary celebratory year is kind of talk to lots of people and help create a movement. What's the kind of world we would like to see? And what's the kind of world we would like to live in? And I would love to live in a world where people valued their own creativity and felt empowered and happy to discover it and then use it. Because I know I've seen in my own practice and teaching that once you give someone the permission and the skills to tap into their own creativity, it affects everything that they do. It affects their self-esteem, it affects their ability to work with other people. Their world becomes a better place.
Absolutely. So one of the newest movements that's going on right now is something called social prescribing, where it is exactly that, the permission a physician to write a prescription to their patient to go to an art museum or to walk in the forest or to take music lessons. And it's something that was started in Europe, but Massachusetts actually was the first state agency to fund a pilot for it over the last couple of years. They called it Culture RX. So we had about 8 or 10 different arts organizations and a number of healthcare organizations that were involved, then interview the caregivers about what that meant to them to write prescriptions to their patients. And then, of course, what it meant to the patients. Unfortunately, it happened sort of right during the COVID times, and so we didn't get as good data as we wanted, but it's enough that we identified a lot of the barriers, which are ones that can be solved, such as insurance coverage and transportation, and sort of the social determinants of health sort of hold some things back that we think that we can solve. But it's a very exciting time for social prescription and moving away from I will write you another pill and you will get better, but
Yeah.
instead giving them permission, as you said, to write or to explore beauty with their kids. what I found was a really wonderful, not side effect, but observation was like the Longwood Symphony musicians, the physicians who were writing the prescriptions felt better because they felt that they could be doing something to actually really impact their patients' lives on a long-term basis rather than just another medication or just saying, yes, I understand that it's really hard out there, giving them some new tools.
Was there a lot of pushback from physicians at first who thought this was just like woo-woo and nothing really serious?
I think that there's less than we thought, and also post-pandemic, people are really, really realizing the impact of isolation and loneliness on mental health. And isolation and loneliness actually affects cardiac health,
Mm,
and it affects your, your nutrition and your motivation to do anything. So all of those things, I think, have made it. They've started to really understand that we need to think beyond what we were doing before.
right. And I'm sure that for a lot of patients, when they get a prescription like that from a doctor, it completely changes their thinking about what it means to be creative or to have those kinds of experiences because doctors, I hate to say it, but doctors are gods. You go to the doctor and the doctor's going to fix you. So if the doctor says, I believe that if you go for a walk in the woods or if you go to a museum or you write a poem, this will help fix you, I think you're more likely to believe it.
Absolutely. I think we have a long way to go because, this has really gotten ingrained in us that the doctors know everything but on the science side, and the arts are sitting there on the other side. And building that corpus callosum across the two sides of the brain is critical, but it is coming, especially now, also, as I said, with the neuroscientists really showing that your brain is different on art. Your brain is different after experiencing beauty. Your brain is different from playing music. That was always sort of an observation that they couldn't back up with, a picture being worth a thousand words. So it's, all of these pieces are moving in the right direction, and it's an exciting time. There's also a Sound Health Initiative and the Sound Health Network. It's a partnership between the Kennedy Center, Renee
Oh,
Fleming, and Francis Collins, who was the head of the National Institutes of Health. Francis Collins is a physician, but also a guitarist and a banjo player. He's a musician. And of course, Renee Fleming is an opera singer. And they started talking and partnering together. And so now Renee is incredibly passionate about finding out how we can promote health through music. And the NIH, across all of its institutes, is equally interested in that. And so now they're really putting a lot of funding into research. They're having summits and conferences that bring together the voices of not just the scientists and not just the musicians, but the music therapists, the music educators, and policymakers to really sort of see what they can do to promote music for healing in patients with Alzheimer's, for example, patients with Parkinson's who move better when they're dancing to music, but also to children, because, as we said, we have to start from the pipeline, having children play music as kids to grow up to be able to embrace it as they get older. But you can start music at any age, and your brain still is neuroplastic enough to change.
well, that's good to know. That's very good to know. But
That's
those
why you're
people who
playing
want
the
to start
drums.
violin at age 45.
Absolutely. That's why you're playing the drums now.
That's right. This also reminds me, you have a connection with El Sistema, right? Talk a little bit about that and maybe explain for those who don't know what it is.
So El Sistema was started in Venezuela by a visionary economist, a violinist, conductor named Jose Antonio Abreu. He is also, well, I guess he's very religious. I don't think he was a theologian professionally, but he believed that everyone should have the opportunity to play music. And what we were talking about before with ability to experiment, their phrase was tocar y lucar, which is play and fight. And in a violent barrio in Venezuela, it's safer to play and fight against your musical colleague and see if you can play music better and better compared to them, but on a friendly basis than to pull out a knife or, be involved in violence. And he took this to a level that was unprecedented. He visualized that someday there would be 1 million kids playing in El Sistema. And that has been realized. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but before that, he had established in every state in Venezuela a music program where every child who wants to get an instrument to play gets an instrument to play, funded by the social services departments of the government. And the younger ones would learn from the older ones, and the older ones learned how to teach and got paid for it. So this program in Venezuela, it was so successful. His vision was that he wanted everyone in South America to experience it. So he sent out teachers to all the different countries in South America. We in the United States also heard about it. And Sir Simon Rattle from London was a champion of it. So back in the early 2000s, I went down there with my daughter, who was a musician in one of the New England Conservatory orchestras. And I went as a chaperone. And as soon as I saw it, and as a pediatrician, I said, oh, well, this is really one of the answers of childhood resilience and creativity. And so I became a real passionate follower of Sistema. And it has now grown to be in many, many, many countries across the world. There's a Sistema Europe, there's a Sistema Japan. And here in the United States, New England Conservatory started a Sistema Fellowship Program, and now there's over 50 sites across the country, a number of them being here in the Boston area. So then the Conservatory Lab Charter School, which is the school that I'm involved with the 450 kids who play music, is based loosely on a Sistema program, basically that everyone can play. There's no reason why, no child should play, and they all learn something from it and from each other.
Yeah, it's an amazing program. And of course, one of the first great musicians to come out of it is Dudamel, the conductor in Los Angeles, right? But he's going to go to the New York Philharmonic. He's
Well, he's very
incredible.
good friends with a lot of the Venezuelans who've moved here. So it's the Venezuelan diaspora is quite broad now, and things were very difficult and continue to be in Venezuela itself. Sistema still continues, but not as robustly as it had been. And so many of the top musicians scattered around the world, such as in the Berlin Philharmonic, but also conducting, Dudamel conducting. And when I met him, he was 17. When my daughter was 15, he was 17. And they said, well, we have this young conductor who's going to conduct Romeo and Juliet while you're here. And we saw him. It's like, what? Who is that? He was phenomenal from then on. But the most important thing about him is that he believes in music and community to a really large extent. The new executive director for Boston Symphony came from the LA programs. And so he's also very interested in music education. So it'll be interesting to see.
That's great. I feel like I could talk to you forever, but we probably should put a cap on this. But is there anything else that you'd like to say about creativity? You've talked about your background, but was there one or two special things growing up in your childhood or in your culture or whatever that you think really helped you realize the importance of creativity in your own life?
Yeah, I've been thinking back. I lost my mom about 2 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago. She was 97. And she and I we were team partners when I was growing up. I also felt like I was always free to push back very hard on her. But now that I've gotten some perspective, and now that I'm a mom and a grandma myself, I realize how many art forms she introduced me to as I was growing up. I went to a school, Punahou. It assumed that you needed to learn every art form that you could. So we learned every dance form, hula and ballroom dancing and ballet. And we also learned yoga. We also learned Hawaiian arts as well as painting. We tried every kind of instrument. We basically, everybody did that. But at home, my mother was also saying, well, this is how you crochet. This is how you knit. You should probably sew some of your own clothing. And I was her second chef in the kitchen, and never realized until later that she had enrolled me in Chinese cooking class when I was 8 because my older siblings were taking it. That meant that I was standing over a hot wok and chopping with a cleaver when I was 8 years old. And it was just like, this is what you do. Like, okay, this is what I do. And it wasn't like, oh, be careful, don't cut your finger off. So from that, I had a lot of freedom in experimentation and creativity. And it was just unspoken, but I didn't realize that all of those opportunities were there. And growing up in Hawaii, we made stuff out of a lot of stuff. We made things out of coconut fronds, and we decorated shells that we found on the beach, and we made sculptures out of sand and glue and things like that. And it was just sort of, that's the stuff you did. It was probably easier because we didn't have cell phones and electronic equipment, and we had seemingly a lot of time on our hands. But I was learning 3 instruments. I was in an orchestra. But I read so much, and I had time to sew my own outfits. And so I don't know how the time went that way, but that's where I learned my creativity. But I have to say, one other thing I wanted to mention is that I teach a course on the role of music in education and health at Harvard for undergraduates who are predominantly neuroscience, psychology, and pre-med majors, giving them permission to continue the music that they had already been doing. because very often nowadays when the college kids get there, they have to give up my silly things, which is my music or my dance. But those are the things that make them happy because I have to do something serious like being a scientist. So my course is to say you don't have to do that. You can combine them, again, giving permission to stay on. And I also teach a course with Cristina Pato, she was a professional bagpipe player from Spain, but then was playing in Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road project for a decade or two. We teach a course on creativity, actually. And based on the premise that Yo-Yo had, the edge effect, that the most creative things that happen are at the edge of two borders. So the ecological edge is like between the savanna and the desert, or the forest and the grasslands. If the biodiversity at that edge is the most, because you have insects or animals that are trying to live on both borders. Similarly for musician scientists and people who are academics who are also creatives, that's where they can be most creative, at that borderline where it seems like people say you can't cross that, and you find ways to do that.
That is fascinating. I hadn't heard that, but it really resonates with me because, I started all of this in Cambodia. I had no idea I was going to do this, but being in Cambodia forced me into this position where I was really kind of tottering on the edge of two cultures. And that made me think in very different ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. And I think with that, I have to say thank you so very, very much, Lisa. Lisa Wong, you are wonderful and a real gift to the community, both the music community and the science community and the creativity community. And I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been fun to speak with you, and thank you for everything that you do, Sue.
You're welcome. And thank you to our listeners for listening to this episode of our podcast. Please subscribe and review because that does help us a lot. And if you want more information about Writing Through, what we do, how we do it, please check out our website at www.writingthrough.org or find us on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Look forward to next time. Thanks a lot. Bye. Next month, I'm joined by Lucia Oriana, an Ecuadorian social psychologist turned published poet and writer. As she has been a long-term Writing Through volunteer, I have had the joy of watching her discover her voice as a writer and embrace writing both in English and her mother tongue, Spanish. We talk about the differences of writing in different languages, the real meaning of translation, and how it's never too late to try something completely new. Here is a short clip from our chat.
I imitate things that other writers have done, trying to deconstruct what they have done and what can I change, deconstruct, working here, why this thing is producing this emotional reaction in me. And then you can kind of apply those rules to a different topic, a different setting, a different language, right? And then, of course, it becomes something totally different